hurt her, that I didn't mean to hurt her and didn't realize I was hurting her. Because all my life I was of the kind that I'd do anything for anyone to make them happy. To do something deliberately to make somebody sad, it wasn't my nature, and it just really did tell on me. But we patched that up real fast. And
so tell us about yours and Daddy's marriage.
and that's something that at that time I was doing World War II, and Uncle Jay and Uncle Bert had both gotten summons to report. They got an invitation from Uncle Sam to report for duty. Well, lo and behold, Daddy got an invitation to report to duty too. And he said, well, I can't go and leave things like they are, so we better get married so that I could get whatever benefits there was for him being in the service, you know, and taking care of Donnie and whatnot. So we talked about it, and they said the rumor was if you went to El Paso, then sometimes you had to wait 3 or 4 days to get a marriage license because there were so many people getting married. But they said you go to Deming, and it wasn't so hard to get a marriage license. So I went to, Elvin and June Wetton, my cousin, went with us out to be witnesses. And I was going to get me a permanent, and I was going to buy me a new dress, and we were really going to do it upright. And you know, we weren't taught to get married in the temple. I guess possibly because it was an impossibility when we was growing up, and I don't know, we all have, and we all knew we was going to, but not many of us did to begin with. But anyway, we went down to apply for the marriage license, and the gal that was behind the desk, he said, well, when do you want to get married? And he said, well, as soon as we can. He said, how about right now? And I looked at Daddy, and my heart just sank. I didn't have my permanent, I didn't have my new dress, and June and Elvin wasn't there, and I didn't want it done this way. But he said, well, maybe she's not aware of the things, and so he said, oh, Judge Winberg is upstairs. So she picked up the phone, and she said, Judge Winberg, there's a couple down here who wants to get married. Are you interested in doing it? Are you available? And he said, send them up. So he sent Daddy next door to get a blood test. And we went up in Judge Winberg's office, and he asked Daddy where he was from. He noticed how he was dressed, and he said, he was from Mexico. He had a ranch down there. Oh, do you have any wildlife? Well, yeah, they had white-tailed deer, and they had this, and they had that. Oh, I just loved hunting deer. Can I come down and go hunting? For 15 minutes, they talked about how Judge Winberg liked to go hunting and what he could do if he went to the ranch. And I was getting awfully nervous and thinking, this can't be a reality. And then he opened the door and said, so-and-so and so come in, I need a couple of witnesses. Well, they came in and put their John Henry on our marriage license and went back in and shut the door. And he turned to me and he said, Martha Wetton, do you promise that you will always take care of this man, love him, care for him, most of all obey him, respect him as your senior, and one that's had more experience than you? And he went on and on about all of these things that I was supposed to do. When he stopped, I was wondering if he was thinking up something else, and he said, you're supposed to say I do. So I said, I do. And then he just told Daddy, he says, do you want her to be your wife? And he said, yes. He said, okay, say I do. And so Daddy said, I do. And he said, okay, I pronounce you man and wife. And look for me down at the ranch one of these days, because I'm coming down hunting.
So did he ever go down?
No, he never went down. And we went back to the hotel, and I was in tears. I told Daddy, I said, that isn't the way I wanted it to happen. And he said, well, but it did happen. We didn't have to wait, and we didn't have to go to Deming. And so we got home, and June and Elvin was waiting for us in the lobby of the hotel, and we told them, and they were really upset at us. And we went from there down home. And no, we didn't go from there down home. We went up to Albuquerque to see his folks, and then we went home. And Anna and Uncle Rulon and Grandma lived in Albuquerque, and so we went from there on then up to Albuquerque to see them, and then we went home. Packed up my baggage and whatever things I had there, and went to the ranch, and that's where my life started as a married woman. And he started calling me vieja. He called me that all his days.
Which means?
Old woman. He's 18 years older than I, but he always called me vieja.
Okay, now Leola was still up with your mom, so you had Donnie, and tell us what he was like and all the way through when he passed away.
Donnie was a little nuisance when he was real little, but he was a special soul, and I guess his time for life was very limited because he grew in maturity just starting from when his mother was born or died. Why, he seemed to understand far beyond his concept. I'd take Donnie down with me when I went shopping. I'd give him a little money to buy something. Well, he'd buy something for every one of those little kids, and he'd never buy anything for himself. And I asked him one day, I said, don't you want something? And he said, he got to where he's calling me Mama. He used to call me Aunt Martha, but he got to where he's calling me Mama, and he said, I have anything that I need. Those kids don't have anything. And he said, I think they're entitled to a little bit of happiness, and if I can help them do it, then I want to help them do it. And I said, then I think you should. But I usually, as a rule, I bought something for him that he didn't, that I could tell that he wanted. I'd buy it for him, but he never bought anything for himself. He had an understanding of right and wrong. He had a depth of the importance of baptism. When he was real little, before his mother died, he had sleeping sickness, and I don't remember how long he slept, whether it was a week or a month or 2 months or whatever, but he was in the hospital. And I don't know, he would talk about his baptism as if it had a deeper meaning, like he was a convert rather than a little boy. And he held on until he was baptized, and then we went to the ranch for that summer, and on the 10th of June, it was just 4 months since Netta had been born. Oh, he loved Netta. He just thought Netta was pure joy, and he'd go talk to her, and he'd come in and tell me different things that Netta said. And I'd say, how do you know? Well, she told me.
Donnie's last day.
We had been to El Paso and I'd gotten some material to make Leola her school dresses, and back then, believe it or not, I used to make Donnie's shirts too. And when Daddy got up, why, he said he was going to take the Caterpillar and route a new route up over the Colorado there to put in a new tank, surface tank. And Donnie said, let me go, and so your dad said, okay. And so he came up to me and he said, today is Lita's birthday, and so let's have a birthday party, and I want you to make a cake. And I said, I can't make a cake because I don't have any eggs. And he said, well, I'll go get you some eggs. So he went out and looked in the mesquite bushes and found 4 eggs, and he came back in. He said, here's the eggs. Then he went in and picked up Netta. He called her Iolita because her name was Iola Lynette, and he called her Lita. And he picked her up, and I don't know what he said to her, but he held her for quite a while. I watched her, not quite a while, probably a few seconds or even minutes. And then he kissed her and laid her down, and he came back in running, and he said, we'll be back after a while. Well, I didn't expect him till afternoon, and they hadn't been gone. The trailer house, and this is a picture of the trailer house, and it had it only had 2 rooms, the kitchen and the bedroom, and the bedroom was bed wall to wall, and the kitchen, the table was the door to the cupboard, and there wasn't much room in either one. Yet there were 2 little Mexican kids, Donnie's age, and Donnie, and the cook and his wife. So there were 5 of them in that little trailer house. And you couldn't get out of the trailer house unless you reached over down through the window of the door to unlock it on the outside, because it was locked on the inside, so there's no way to get out. And so they went on their way, and Leola and I were cutting out dresses and having the most fun, and looked out, and here came saw this dust just blowing like mad. And it reminded me once before when I saw the dust like that. So I told Leola, I said, let's fold this up, and there's trouble. Well, when Daddy drove in, he brought, Celso was the one that brought him in, brought Donnie in wrapped up in a quilt. And I thought, well, those idiots are going to smother him. He went in, put him on the bed, and walked out. So I went in, and I thought he was unconscious. And I started to talk to him. He only had 1 drop of blood under 1 nostril. And he lay there so sweet and so calm and so peaceful, and I realized that he had left. So I went out to see your dad, and he was out under the tree. He didn't even come in the house. He said we need to get him to town as fast as we can, because we have to take him to Colonial Wars tonight. So I fixed Netta's bottles and fixed us a lunch, and we loaded up, packed our bags, and went over to Biomada, where he was embalmed. As we sat and waited for the embalming, it started to rain, and I thought, oh, we can't go through that nightmare again. But we did. We put him in the going from the ranch to Biomada. I had him wrapped in a blanket, and Celso and Nuero sat in the back and held him. And when it came time to go, we went from Biomada over. Well, then we had another nightmare of fighting the mud and getting stuck and everything all night long, and bouncing. Only this time the casket was little. You could hear it bounce, and you could see it hit side to side. Sometimes it'd roll up and hit the cab. It just literally tore out my heart. That little boy that I'd loved so as my own now had taken his exit too. And we were following his mother's footsteps and taking him through the muddy water to get him over where we could lay him to the side of her. My dad always had muddy water dreams if anything in the family went wrong, and he was in the mountains, and he had the muddy water dream. And his dad's last wife was sick, his Aunt Ellis, and she was sick, and he thought maybe she had died, so he came down, and she was all right. So he had to go to El Paso for something, and he went down to Cascade and was sitting on the train, waiting for the train to leave. As we passed, the train was stopped, and we crossed in front of it with Donnie to go over to my sister Laverne's, because there again I didn't want to go tell Mama that Donnie had died. So we picked up Aunt Bernie, and we took her up with us, and we had just been up there canning fruit too the week before, and she said, well, I didn't realize you'd be back so soon. And Aunt Bernie walked up to her and said, Mama, they didn't come to get more fruit. She said, Donnie's dead, and they brought him. And the only time that I ever saw my mom lose control. But she loved that little boy just like everybody else did, and she refused to accept the fact until she looked in and saw the casket. And there again we went over and buried him, and then we had the funeral, and then we went back to then we went back down to the ranch. And after that, Leola was Oh, she was real. She could do anything. She was very talented. Now, you remember all the good times you used to have in Chihuahua?
Yep.
We'd stay at the Hotel Victoria. You guys would go out and swim in the backyard. Well, there are several pictures. These pictures of Chihuahua are really. Marty was little, and it was there in Chihuahua on the Hotel Victoria that your dad got offered $1 million for Marty because she was so cute and everybody. She was so obvious, you know. Marty was Marty, and everybody noticed her because she was so smart. If she saw something that she didn't understand, she'd ask, and if it embarrassed somebody, why, she was just a little child. And we used to have so many good times in Chihuahua. Well, hey, you tell about the rooster.
Yeah, I remember one time Dad come home and he says, Rick, go out and gather the eggs in the chicken house. And so I says, well, Dad, I would, but I can't get in there because that rooster always chases me. And he says, oh, that rooster won't hurt you. Go out and get him. I said, no, the rooster's going to get me. So he says, well, I'll go out and show you. I says, okay, let's go. So I went out there. He opened the gate to that chicken coop and walked in there, and that rooster come a-flying towards him, and he grabbed that sucker by the neck and wrung its neck, and he says, give it to your mom. That's the last time we had trouble with that old rooster.
So we had chicken and dumplings for lunch.
Yeah.
Okay, he had a nephew, but it was more like a brother, Cecil Casey, and his wife was Ruth. As a matter of fact, Aunt Ruth was the one that was related to him because Aunt Minnie's daughter, and she was an alcoholic, and he was a contractor. So he came up. They lived down in Brownfield, Texas, and they came up to the house, and he said he'd build us a new house. So we bought. I got my plan just exactly like I wanted, my ideal home, and we had to buy 2 lots before we got. We had to change lots and buy one because it wasn't big enough to make a long story short. He was the one that built that house exactly like I wanted it, and it was my dream house. It was my castle. Even your dad said it was a castle, but without the queen, a castle's no good. So he used to spend too much time there in the house, even when he came to town. If I wasn't in the house, I wouldn't have run an errand and not knowing he was coming or whatnot. But we moved in that house when in 1960. In 1961, I lost my dad. It was my 3rd experience with losing an ancestor. My grandfather was the first one, and then my mom, and then of course, my mother that died when I was little. But then in 1964, well, in 1963, Daddy never did forget you kids' birthday. Why did he always make it your birthday and he didn't the other kids'?
Something special.
Because you were special is right, and because you was supposed to have been born on his birthday, but you missed it because I was always pokey and giving delivery, but he never missed his and Rick's birthday. And we always celebrated on your dad's birthday. I don't think you knew you had another day until he died.
Well, not even that. I remember when I was 16, I went down to get my driver's license, and they said, what was your birthday? So I said, November 20th. And that didn't even register on me until I was actually looking at my driver's license, and I said November 20th. I said, that isn't my birthday, mine's the 21st.
Well, in 1963, we went up to the White Sands and celebrated their birthday, and the picture of he and his 2 sons and he and his 2 daughters at the White Sands is one that we will always cherish. On my birthday in that same year, 63, we had, he gave me, well, on the 1st of September, on July, he gave me a 5-pound box of chocolates with his card, And then he, on our anniversary on the 1st of September, well, then he gave me this anniversary card, which was the last one that we got. And then in October, he had been out and was going back to get some beef because it was cold enough, and he said he'd be back in a couple of days. Well, a couple of days went into a week, and he never called. He didn't have a phone at the ranch because it was primitive, but he could go to Biomada, which was the county seat, and he could call from there. So if he ever found that he couldn't come home, well, then he would go ahead and he'd go to Biomada and call and say that he was late. Well, a week went into 10 days, and 10 days went into 2 weeks, and I finally started having nightmares, dreaming that he was dead and whatnot. He'd been threatened to be killed by some people down there that thought that he was rich, and they could threaten him, so they'd leave a note for him to leave so much money on such place and such a date. And I thought that he probably, I was in my dreams, he'd been killed by somebody that wanted his truck and his money. But I finally called Uncle Jay and told him that I'd called him several times, and he said, "Oh, you worry too much." He said, "He's all right, he's all right." So I finally called him and said, "If you don't go see," I said, "I'm going to take the boys and we're going to go down and find him." "Okay, we'll go." Well, that night I really had the nightmare, and the day that they went over, and I didn't sleep. I walked the floor and whatnot, and about mid-morning, the bishop's wife, Mary Red, who was a real good friend of mine, came over to see me. She says, "How you doing?" And I said, "Not very good." I said, "I couldn't sleep at all last night. I keep dreaming that Don's dead." And I said, "I keep waiting for his phone call," and I said, "It doesn't come." About that time, the phone rang, and I answered it, and it was the Mexican operator, and I said, "Oh, they found him, and everything's okay because they found him." And it was my brother's voice, and he said, "Martha, we have found Don, and he's dead." Well, there's no proper way to say that other than how they said it. Then I realized why Mary was there. When they found him, why then they went to Biomada and called Aunt May, and Aunt May called Mary Red and told her to go over there so I wouldn't be alone. As the kids came home from school, and I told them, of course each one reacted in their own way, but little Marty had so much faith. She said, and she was so close to her dad, and her dad thought that she was just, to think that he could have one that perfect and that sweet and that smart at his age really made him more special. And she said, "Oh, he won't stay dead." He said, "I found out in primary that if we go bless him, why then he'll be made well." So she hopped over and got Uncle Jay by the hand and Uncle Bert by the hand, and she said, "Let's go down to the ranch and you pray for Daddy and he'll be made well. Come on." And she started pulling them, and they said they couldn't. That he was gone and they couldn't bring him back. And she's come to me, wrapped her little arms around my legs, and she said, "They just want my dad dead. They don't even want to make him live." And I guess at that time period, with her little faith, had we had an opportunity to exercise faith, then maybe he wouldn't have been taken. So my consolation there is that it must have been his time to have gone, because we had no opportunity to express our faith or to show our faith or anything. And of course, make a long story short, the family was called and we all went down. We traveled at night and got there the next morning at...
What did the people in Biomada do?
Oh, when they were waiting to embalm him, everybody in Biomada and Moctezuma closed down their doors of trade and everything, and they all lined the streets. Some of them, they got rides however they could. Some struck out and was walking and others would pick him up. They lined the streets and stood in the park and was crying. They lamented his loss so much. And when I went down afterwards to see the banker, because I had no idea about what the expense was down there, he told me that never in the history of that town had everything closed its doors. The buses came by and there was nobody to sell any tortillas or taquitos or anything. There wasn't anybody pump gas. Everybody, he said, I think everybody in this town owes your husband something. And I kind of believe that. He loved those people with all his heart. And every time we went through town, do you ever remember going through town that he didn't stop him? Somebody didn't stop him, Rick, and say the wife was sick, or there's out of work, or a child was sick, and he stuck his hand in his pocket and come out with something? Do you remember that? Yeah. And I asked him one time, I says, does that pocket ever run dry? And he said, yes, but I've never put my hand in an empty pocket to help these people that I didn't come out with something. So the Lord blessed him in helping them to get by, and he was truly a man. And they say it's a world a better place because you were born. That part of the world was definitely a better place because he was born. And when we got the Colonial Wars, why, it was a very timey time to lay him away because it was drizzling just a little bit and it was just sunup. His most favorite time. And I remember looking at that of Aunt Iola's grave and Donnie's grave, and then seeing them lower Daddy in the grave next to him. I wondered how I could be so selfish to hurt so bad when he was being reunited with two that he loved so dearly. But from then on, that has been, in October it'll be 40 years. He left me with five kids and to raise, and I knew absolutely, I felt like I had lost my world. But anyway, to go on, the Lord blessed me. I spent a lot of time on my knees, a lot of time in tears, but when we see how things finally ended up, Rick went on his mission and came home, and he came home in December, and I decided to marry Barton, and we went to Tucson. I sold the house that was so dear to me because it was my dream house with Daddy. But we sold it and bought a house in Tucson, and I think maybe that marriage was supposed to have been, because it's where Rick met Barbara and Anna Mae met Byron and Marty met Mark, and we moved from there to, when Barton got fired from El Taco, we moved back to El Paso and bought the same house back, and Barton went in with Randy Wall and was buying some Lucky Boy stores, and Rick was running one, and Dan was running the pickup. He'd be a delivery boy and pickup boy and whatnot. And Rick could make the best doggone onion rings. I tell you what, I'd walk down there to get an onion ring if I had to. It was a real good time. And then we went broke on that, and so we moved to Phoenix, and from Phoenix, one day Marty called me and said, Mother, you said you wanted a house close to the temple with, so you could walk, and says there's a house in the papers, has 3 bedrooms and a basement and 2 baths, and do you want to look at it? And I said yes. And so we went over, and I went over, and we called the guy, and he showed it to us, and it was that house at 443 2nd Avenue. And when I drove in that driveway, I knew that house was mine. And Barton didn't want it because across the street was a bunch of rentals. It was Little Mexico, really. And he said, no, spend your money on something else. He said, let's don't buy this. And I told him that I felt like that was my place. And as time passed, it was there. We moved in on the moved in on that house on the 29th of May, and on the 2nd of June, I started working at the temple. But I worked for 2 months without being called. I just worked in the locker area because my bishop didn't ever get the proper information to him, and so I worked for 2 weeks, and 2 months till 2nd of August before I was set apart as a ordinance worker. But I will tell you one thing for sure: I have never been in a place where I have literally seen the hand of the Lord work in so many miraculous ways to bless those people. I was called to be assistant supervisor within 6 months, and then within a year I was supervisor, and I held that position for almost 9 years. Up till today, I've completed my 25th year, and I'm hopefully going to have many more years. But I would like, in closing this, I would like to tell of some of the, I think the ranch was a good experience for us to develop our faith, because Uncle Dan used to say that the reason he and Rick was protected like they were was because of my faith and my prayers. And I tell you, I'm one that does believe in asking, and I do acknowledge when it's received. But some of the miracles that to me was miracles that happened at the ranch was when Henny and I went down to pull a cow that was stuck in the tank, and was going to pull that cow out. And the reason we went was because Daddy'd been up so early and gone over to 80s to collect for some tank work, and he felt he was so tired, and I said, well, I can go to take Henny and go down, and so we did. When I drove in, I backed in and got stuck, and the rope wasn't long enough, so I pulled out and went in front first, and it still wasn't long enough, and so then I decided, well, I can't reach him, and I couldn't go back because I was stuck, so I decided to circle the tank, which I had seen Daddy do so many times. He did it so many times to scare me, because the truck would tip, and that'd scare me. And I went so far, and the motor died, and so I tried to start it, and I had no clutch, and I thought, oh, I burned out his clutch, and he'd have to go to El Paso. And then I was feeling bad to think I'd caused more work instead of helping, and I kept trying, and I knew how to drive with a stick, because with a clutch, because that's what I learned to drive on, and that's what I drove all those times at the ranch. We never had an automatic. It was always stick. I knew that the clutch wasn't working. So I told Lynette, I said, well, we're going to have to walk home. And it was cloudy and a real nice day, and we started out with a nice little clip, and we walked, and pretty soon the clouds went away, and the sun came out, and it got real hot. And the only time that I ever considered drinking in the mud hole of those surface tanks, I did. And we kept walking. It was about to get dark when we saw that Daddy was coming with Rick and Dan and the cowboy, some horses, and he said, what's the matter? And I broke down and cried, and I was so sorry to think I'd caused him this extra work and expense and whatnot, and he was afoot, and I'd have to use Henyo's the car that Weddle used. And so he sent me back with the boys and told me to take a bath and go to bed, and he'd be home. I said, it's no use. The clutch is burned out. Well, I did. I went, took a bath, and I prayed, and I cried, and I prayed, and I cried, and pretty soon I saw some lights coming. And so I went outside and stood by the gate, and he drove in, and he picked me up in his arms, and he said, Via, how was you going to get out of that tank? I said, I was going to circle it like I saw you do so many times. And he said, if you'd gone 5 foot farther, you would have tipped over and rolled down 15 foot into that tank. Then we both cried to think that the Lord had made the clutch not work for me, and yet it did work for him. And another evidence of real faith was when Dan was on his mission, why, we had a cowboy that only worked for us for, oh, he hadn't even been there a week, had he, Rick? And he went down to the Pecahosa and got on a ladder to get up to the tank to get him a drink, and he'd only gotten 2 steps off the thing and fell and broke his pelvic bone. Well, he came in, they brought him in the back of Wedo's pickup, and Rick had been gone. I'd been up to the corral 2 or 3 times to see if I could see him coming in, and I couldn't see him coming. And I was feeling so badly to think he'd been on the horse for so long, and I had his dinner ready, and I had a cold drink, and I was just really getting concerned because Rick had been gone so long. Well, I said, well, we have to take him to Villamother, so I told him to load him in the pickup, and then I saw Rick coming, and I told him what had happened, and I said, your dinner's ready, and I'll just run him to Villamother and be right back. And he said, okay. Well, he walked in the house. Anna Mae was going with me. He walked in the house, and I hadn't even got very far, then he came out, and he said, I feel impressed to go with you. Well, that pleased me. I knew he was just still bone tired, but I knew he was a better driver than I was, simply because, oh, I don't know, he's a man, I guess, and he'd become a man. We went over and stayed, and it took so long for them to take care of that cowboy. And to make a long story short, we had to take him to Chihuahua. They couldn't do anything there, so we brought him back to Moctezuma, woke him up, they left him on a stretcher, laid him on the table. Well, we went over to take Anna Mae home to stay with Marty, and I had a maid at that time. And we got just about to our fence, and it had rained, and I tell you, we slipped and slid and slipped and slid, and I was so glad Rick was behind that wheel because he got us in there, got us home okay. And then I told him to go ahead and go to bed, and I would go up, and when the cowboys got up, and I'd have them saddle some horses, and if they needed to, they could pull us out. Well, I never did go to bed. I didn't even take my shoes off. I just spent time with the Lord, pleading for help, because I knew that in and of ourselves there was no way for us to get out of there, and without help. Well, I went up and told Wedo, and he said, well, I'll go and break the track for you so you can come. Well, when Rick woke up and had his breakfast, well, we decided to go. Well, Wedo didn't. He said, we'll take the high road instead of the low road. Well, the road was just wide enough for 2 cars, and then there was a ditch on both sides that will drain the water off to help the road to stay drier. Well, Wedo said the other road was less dangerous, and so he started out that way. He kept getting stuck, and Rick said, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to follow him. I'm going to take my own. I'm going to go across here and hit the regular road. Well, that really worried me because I didn't know with his experience, because Dan had driven until he went on his mission, and Rick hadn't really driven that much. And he had to jump that ditch and yet not go off into the other ditch, and he only had maybe 25 or 30 foot to straighten out to hit the cattle guard without taking down the fence. So I told him, I said, okay, you do it, but I don't want to be in the car. So I got out of the car and I walked ahead. And I was crying, and I was praying that we could do it, because it was on a good humanitarian effort. We had to get this guy to help. And I heard Wedo zoom up his thing, and he came and crossed the cattle guard, and I thought, okay, if Wedo can do it, Rick can. And then I heard Rick speed his motor up a little bit, and I heard that truck coming, and then I heard the cattle guard. By the time I nearly went on my knees in all that mud, I was walking in mud up to my ankles. But I knew that the Lord had heard my prayer, and that he had helped Rick to jump that ditch and not lose control. When Rick got up, of course, I was blubbering, because I was so grateful for the power of prayer and for the help that would be obtained. And Rick said, Mother, he said, when I hit that ditch, I lost control of the wheel. He said, Daddy drove me over that cattle guard. And I knew that he had, simply because, not because Vic wasn't a good driver, but that he wasn't that experienced. And then we got the guy to thing. The other one I'd like to tell you about is when Rick was on his mission and Dan was out in Chandler working. We had another rainstorm where we couldn't get out, and I was down there with the girls by myself, and we always had a lot of kids there for the summer. And this particular time, when the water was running real deep, why then along with something came that somebody got a bug, and it was a real high fever. And every time I went to El Paso, I always took home a bunch of aspirin and rubbing alcohol and stuff like that. Well, little by little, each one of them took the fever, so I used the aspirin and the rubbing alcohol and the ice. Marty was the last one to come and to get it, and when she got it, why then I was out of ice, and I was out of rubbing alcohol and out of aspirin. And so we had to make it an item of prayer, and Randy told me that he still remembered it. We knelt around that little gal as I held her, and they each one said their own prayer. Randy said he was the last one to pray, and Marty got well. To me, that was an answer to prayer, because the kids' lives were saved. Okay, Cory is my photographer, and this is the last chapter of my history, and I certainly appreciate what he's doing. He's a good producer. Let me tell you, my life history is different than any of you kids, is simply because I lived in El Paso by myself, and as you know, Daddy came and went and whatnot. He wasn't usually around at any big events that happened and whatnot, so I had to assume the responsibility of the children pretty much by myself. And then Netta was the only healthy child I have, and you all know what your handicaps were when you were little, and for 2.5 years, why then I still wrapped myself around you, because I was the only security you had at that time. So my life history is around my posterity. My joy and happiness has been through you kids, not only my children, but my grandchildren too. I've had a lot of fun things with them. So let's start from the first. Netta was my first. And I was at the ranch driving trucks. Never went to a doctor at all during my pregnancy. Had a good pregnancy. I could drive trucks. I could take care of the house. I even had to wash and cook for the cowboys, and I did it all. We had Donnie in Dublin with my sister Laverne, and Leola was in Colonial Juarez with my mother going to school. For the first 2 years that I was married, I taught. I kept Donnie, but Leola was big enough to go into elementary school. And so I home taught Donnie. But then when he got into 2nd grade, it was easier for him to go to public school. So Aunt Bernie said she would take him. Well, as time went on, and I got pregnant, and I was getting near the time to have my baby, well, we decided we best buy a home. We debated on whether to buy it in Colonial Juarez or El Paso. But the final decision was El Paso, because it was closer to where he could go for equipment for his well drill or whatever, and he couldn't get it in Colonial Juarez. So we thought by living in Colonial Juarez it would just keep us farther apart or more apart. And so we looked for a little house in El Paso. And as luck would have it, we found a darling little house way out in the suburbs of El Paso. There wasn't anything anywhere around us except a motel, and that belonged to Adams, and it was called El Camino. And everything else was just desert and whatnot, and we got out there simply because we wanted to have our cow and our chickens and go on with our lifestyle that we liked. Well, we found a place that was on 51 East Glenwood Drive. It's the first address that they gave it, and then we changed later. But it was only a 2-bedroom at that time, but we figured that was pretty good with a 2-bedroom. Leola and Donnie weren't so big, but Donnie slept in our bedroom and Leola had hers. And when Lynette came, When I found out that I was pregnant with Lynette, though, I was really afraid to have a baby because I knew that, well, I thought that because I'd been told I was more like my mother than any of my mother's children, and she died in childbirth. And I was so upset about it that Daddy took me to Colonial Horse to talk to Mama. And I expressed my fears of having Lynette. And she says, "Don't worry, darling, you're not going to die." She said, "Every baby you have, I will be there to make sure that you are okay, and I will help you through it." And so that gave me confidence to go ahead and have Lynette. Well, Lynette, being the firstborn, was such a joy. She was a beautiful child. She came all bubbly and happy. She was born with a happy disposition. By the time she was 4 years old, she could sing all of the verses to the hit parade, which came on. There were 10 songs. She took to the piano like a duck to water. She really did thrill her dad by what she could do. When she was in elementary school, elementary, she was playing for Sunday school. When she was in high school, she was playing the organ in church. And one of my greatest memories with her was when we both worked together with the music. She was the organist and I was chorister in Relief Society and Sunday school. And then too, she was always the one that made Thanksgiving and Christmas such a fun thing. She adopted the grandchildren, and as a matter of fact, I used to think they loved her more than they did me, because she was determined that each one of them have such neat Christmases, and Thanksgiving was just another thing for Daddy and Richard's birthday, and so she was really a joy. She was one that took me to Alaska and whatnot, and I was very sorry when she lost her job in El Paso, but I was so thrilled when she came to live with me. She worked got another job and worked really well, and we were real saddened when it ended up that she had got cancer and had her surgery. And even though she put on a good front and whatnot, it was hard to see her go through the chemo, and even harder to watch her leave me. I couldn't go with her. Before, she'd take me by the hand, put me on the train or whatever. I couldn't go with her this time. And then we had Michael, and I guess the only thing that Michael needed was a body, and I was happy to give him that body. He was stillborn, and I have had 2 dreams of him being a full man, a grown man, and I was really surprised when I woke up how close we were. I didn't feel any strangeness. It was just like walking in and seeing, and then putting my arms around Dan and Richard. He is truly a part of our family. My next was Dan, and Danny had when he was a child, they used to go shoot rabbits to feed the dogs, and we had lots of dogs. And he had given one to Puppy and one to Yoron and whatnot, and the pup didn't eat his, and so Dan went to reach for the rabbit to give to Yoron, and the pup bit him and got him right in the cheek. And because he was our dog, we were afraid that maybe he was rabid. And so I loaded the kids in the car and took the dog and the kids out to, Netta and Danny out to the doctor. And Rick was around then too. And they quarantined the dog, but Dan had to have 3 rabies shots. And Dr. Black said he had never seen anybody as brave as that little boy. He said there's no shot given that hurts as bad as a rabies shot, and yet he didn't winch. Little did he know then that the results of this rabies shot would cause the trouble that he has had physically since. He, in spite of the rabies shot causing tumors to grow and whatnot, he still fought the odds. He never let us know what handicap he was fighting. I don't even know if he knew what handicap he was fighting, except that he had trouble walking. But in spite of it, he still went on a mission, did an honorable mission. But when his dad died, he stepped in those shoes of a man and really wore the man's pants until he went on a mission. Then he used to write from the mission field and tell Rick to be sure and take care of Mother and the girls, that he then was the man of the house. And then when he got home from his mission, why, he had a very severe surgery. Left him without the use of his right arm, and his right leg withered and whatnot. But he was still very cheerful. He never complained. I don't think I asked Richard the other day if he had ever heard Dan complain, and he said no. I never heard him complain about anything. Then he married Karen and brought Karen into our family. And I've been surprised and amazed and pleased at how efficient and effective Karen is with her hands. She can do anything, turn anything into a beautiful piece of artistry. They lived with us a time or two, 3 or 4 times as a matter of fact, and as the children came along, I got involved in their activities as long as they were living there at the house. I got into baptism and the boys' ordination to priesthood and whatnot, and thoroughly enjoyed watching them in that first part of their lives, and have been very sorry that now that they are in Oklahoma, I have not seen Dan's grandchildren at all. But I'm sure that they are just as prized and loved and just as special as anybody else. And then Richard, I've had more spiritual experiences with Richard, possibly because he was around more when the necessity of it, and I've already told you of some of the spiritual experiences. But Richard was one who was patient. He was one that Dan, on a roundup, Dan always liked to go catch those that break away from the herd. He was always running cattle, but Richard was always the steadfast. He was always the one that brought up the dust. He ate more dust, his dad said, than any cowboy that he'd ever hired. And he said that man is really going to be a man someday, simply because of his disposition to endure and to see. He said he could see better and locate cattle that even he couldn't see. So he said, if I'm looking for something, I always take Richard with me because he can see, and he sees it better. And then he also did a mission. Neither one of them went to college per se. Dan tried it, but with his handicap, he couldn't manage the classroom, and so he had to drop out. And Richard went into different trades and became an electrician and whatnot, whatever it was. And then when I moved to Tucson with that, he got acquainted with Barbara, and there's no words that can explain the relationship and the joy that I have had with Richard and Barbara. As a matter of fact, Barbara saved my life probably more than once. She made one remark, or she's made it twice, that she was afraid that I would be dead the next morning. But with her, under her guidance and her knowledge, she has me on a situation now that really has given me a second lease on life. We've seen a lot of things here together that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. Spiritual things like the spoken word and things like that. I even saw my first play the other day. But Barbara and I kind of walk the same paths. We understand each other, and it's a real comfort and a joy to be in her home in their home. They have me a room, and they make me think that here's where I belong. And one day, you can't ever tell, I may. Then Anime came along, and Anime was more of my disposition. She was eager to please everybody. She wanted to please Rick and Dan. She wanted to please Netta. And she wanted to be the one that would bring comfort and joy. She was determined to get an education, and she was also determined that she was going to marry somebody that she could travel the world with. And she did both. She got her an education, and she married Byron, and was able to travel to a good many places. And with her traveling, I got to see a lot of places. As a matter of fact, when she was in Alaska was when Netta took me over there twice, and we had so much fun in their home. Byron was a real good guide, and he was a good babysitter. He would keep whatever baby they had on his shoulders while we went in to see this or stopped to see that, and he never complained about it. So we enjoyed that. But of all the places that they lived, the one I liked the best was Madrid, Spain. I really liked it there. I was privileged to stay with with Byron and Anime while the girls were born. But when the boys came along, Jacob was born in Germany, and I wasn't able to go over then. And the two boys, the little boys, was born in Alaska when it was too cold for me to go. But I have been able to visit them quite a bit in their home. I have attended swim meets and ballet recitals, and I heard Jacob give one of the best talks I've ever heard when he was just a youth. And so I've gotten in on some of their activities, but one of the best was to be at to see the kids married. To back up a little bit, I forgot to mention one of the highlights of Rick and Barb's is that I've been able to attend every one of their children's marriages in the temple that have gotten married, and that has been an exceptionally spiritual experience for me, even though it's been in different temples. And Cherise was married in Mesa, so that was no problem, but I was in Hawaii when Renee got married, and I've had spiritual experiences with each one of these grandchildren as they have gotten endowed and gotten married in the temple. I think Grandpa handpicked every one of these grandchildren, and I think he's kind of doing the same with the great-grands, because they seem to just fit right in. There's no anything strange about it. Anime is also kind of like me. She's thinks that I'm still smart enough that she can discuss her personal life with and what's going on with her family, and she never gets bored or or gives cross with me. She's my Anime. And then Marty came along. When my mother died, when Anime was born, why then I gave away all of my baby things and settled down to raising my 4 children, because I knew in my mind and heart that I couldn't have any more children because my mom was gone. But I got pregnant with Marty, and part of my life was so excited and so happy because of being the mother that I am. I wanted another baby, but I was afraid to have one. And when I found I was pregnant, why then I was devastated, because I was afraid that I would die and leave Daddy alone again, which would break my heart. And I knew that I figured Aunt May would raise my children, but I didn't want her to raise them. They were mine, and I wanted to raise them. And I guess I probably pestered the Lord so much over my prayers and my fears and my tears that he let Mama come to me one night. And she told me that I needed to enjoy that pregnancy, that I was going to have a little girl, and that it was not she that saved my life, that it was the Savior. The Savior was the only one that could take or give lives, that it was not her. And for me to exercise faith, and for me to enjoy that pregnancy, because Marty had made the agreement with me before she was born, that she would be my last born. She would be my soulmate. She would be the one who would care for me when I got old and needed special attention. And Mama was right. Marty has become my soulmate simply because I think she and Mark have always lived real close to me, to where when she needed help, I was available. When I needed help, she was available. I could help more with her children and whatnot than any of the others. And I am sure that she knew when she came that she would have, that we would enjoy the growing up of the kids. I got to see nearly everything that their kids did, and I was so glad to have that experience, because those are the one grandkids that I got to see nearly everything they did. From the time they started T-ball when they was real little, up through their Nicole's their graduations and Nicole's marriage and whatnot. And I enjoyed little Tyler. He calls me Gigi, and he comes in to give me a hug, and he's the one great-grandchild that I live around that I do truly enjoy. Now, for my children, they have been the ones that I have wrapped my life around. Now, you spouses of my children have been real good to put up with me, to accept my being underfoot and whatnot, and I want you to know I love you with all my heart. I appreciate the happiness that you have brought to my children, and the happiness you brought to me. I'm thankful for the good parents that you have been to my great-grandchildren and my grandchildren. Now, you grandchildren, I'm happy that I have gotten to know you, not to the extent that I would like to, but to the extent that I have. I am grateful. I love you. I'm proud of you. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are very special spirits, and that you have joined our family circle because you wanted to, and because we wanted you to. I want you to know that regardless of whether I am present in your home at difficult times, you will always be in my prayers. I will never forget a grandchild, a child, or a great-grandchild. Because, after all, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a great-grandmother. I want each one of you to love your spouses and your children as much as I loved my spouse, and as much as I love my children, and as much as I love you. Now, I want to leave my testimony with you, that I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Lord lives, and that Jesus is the Christ. He's our Savior. He is my best friend. Over so many years of adversities and times that I thought I was doing right that ended up being wrong, he seemed to be a lot of times the only friend that I had, the only one that had time for me, the only one that had patience for me. I know the warmth of his love, and I want you to know that he does love each one of you. He's just a phone call away, so to speak. He's just a prayer away, to be honest. And I know that Joseph Smith was the prophet of this dispensation. He was instrumental in giving us the scriptures that means so much to us, that gives us such a good setup on life, rules and commandments and whatnot that make sense, that helps us to become stronger, to helps us endure. I want also to tell you that I have learned through my life that Satan causes adversities, but only the Savior helps you crawl through them or over them or under them or whatever it needs to be, even around them. Don't ever turn loose of the hand of the Savior if you want help, if you want solace, if you want comfort, if you want peace. He's the only man that can give it to you. He is the one that will see that we get back to heaven if we will let him. He will never knock down our doors, but he will always enter in if we'll just let him. I love the Book of Mormon in a special manner. It has really been a true guide to me. And I want each one of you to know that beyond a shadow of a doubt, next to the Savior himself, I love each one. And I ask God's blessings to be upon you, that as you look at this and read it, know for surety there's one person on earth that loves you dearer than life. And I'll be waiting for you somewhere. Families can be forever. Our family's going to be forever. And if I don't see some of you again in this mortal life, rest assuredly that Grandpa and I will be waiting for you. Dad and I will be waiting for you. Great-grandfather and I will be waiting for you. We are a family. We are an eternal family. And I leave this blessing with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.